first learned about Edulastic, I was blown away by it, and of course, first thought about all of the amazing ways that I could use it for assessments. But over the last couple of years, I've really loved learning how to use it throughout the entire learning process, and it's been a game changer. And it's really nice to know that it doesn't have to just be something that I use for that summative assessment. So to start with, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we use it before a new learning cycle really begins. We use it for pretests, and both in order to determine what the next lesson should be, and also to compare it to a post-test and to build background knowledge. So here's an example of our literary elements pretest when I teach 7th graders and 9th graders and sometimes other grades in there as well. We have a 7 through 12 high school. And when our students were coming into the high school from 6th grade, we would still always do a lesson on the literary elements. And then one year we finally realized, they probably already have a pretty good handle, but we didn't want to make any assumptions. So we started doing a literary elements pretest before we started our first unit that really focused heavily on the literary elements. So what we would do is we would give this pretest, and we would have 2 different options prepared for what to do right after this. We would either do a quick review lesson with like Quizlet or Gimkit just to build back some of the automaticity with those definitions, or we would actually have a lesson prepared. So this is the result of our students that took this at the beginning of this year, which of course at the beginning of this year, it was super important to do a pretest because we didn't know how much they got out of last year. And as I was watching my students complete this live in class, I had 2 plans ready. One was a review activity and one was a lesson to actually go over these more in depth. And as you can see, when the average score was 91%, we definitely did not need to do a full lesson. So we just went ahead with the review activity, but it did show me that question 4 then was one that I might need to go back and double check and make sure students are familiar. And I could also review all of the responses from students. And if there was somebody that didn't do super well, check in with them throughout the unit to make sure they were getting what they needed. So we just quickly had 2 lessons ready. They completed the pretest live in class, and depending upon the results, we had one of the lessons ready to go based on their needs. Another thing that we have done is used a pretest so that we could compare it to the post-test. So this is a couple of the questions we asked during our research unit as they get familiar with that research terminology. And then we asked the exact same questions plus a few application questions in the post-test. But here were the results from this year. You can see the pre-test results for questions 1 through 10, and then the post-test results for questions 1 through 10, and they were essentially the exact same questions. So we can see really quickly how well our students have increased their understanding from the pre to the post, and which areas are still a little bit of a struggle, like question 9, which I believe was about bibliographies, because no matter how much we try, they still confuse it with biographies. So the pretest has been really helpful for us to start incorporating, and having the data in Edulastic to look back at to help determine those next steps or make those comparisons at the end are amazing. The other thing we use Edulastic for before learning is to build background knowledge. We read the novel Bud Not Buddy, which takes place during the Great Depression, and our students do not have a great background on the Great Depression. We also read the Wednesday Wars, which takes place during the Vietnam War. And again, they don't have a ton of background information on the Vietnam War. So we use informational text articles with the passage-based questions to give them that background. So those are all just examples of what we do before we really jump into a new unit, either pretests, depending upon what purpose we want those for, or building that background knowledge that students are going to need going forward. Here's just another example of building that background knowledge. My PLC goal that I'm in for this year is actually using graphs and visual data. And so Edulastic really easily allows me to implement or include graphs and data and things like that to help my students with that type of reading as well. Okay, so when we're in the middle of a learning process and we haven't quite made it to the summative assessment state, we use Edulastic for study guides, for simple practice, or for formative assessment. So at the end of last year, when we went to distance learning, I did not have all of my students in my room to teach Romeo and Juliet to my 9th graders. And my goal of Romeo and Juliet is usually to expose them to as many different versions of it as I can. And then we have conversations about, is this text worthy of all of these different iterations of it, all of these different adaptations? And this is one that I like to show a lot. Is there's this guy in like a fried chicken fast food restaurant reciting Act 3, Scene 3 from Romeo and Juliet. And I just like their reaction. It has nothing to do with them analyzing the text at this point, but it's part of that thinking about all of those different ideas. And Edulastic allows me to embed those YouTube videos, which helps them see more information and kind of process. Same thing. You can use GIFs or GIFs, depending upon how you want to say it, in your Edulastic questions as well. So this is actually a Google slide presentation. And then if you go to the website talltweets.com, you can quickly upload your Google Slides presentation and it turns it into a GIF. And so I put this GIF of this children's book that I would typically read through with my students and have a discussion about it in class. And that became something that wasn't a possibility in distance learning. So it was a way that I could still get across a lot of those like general studying the text, but not really digging into the text questions. Well, I didn't have my students necessarily right in front of me, or I didn't have all of them live. So not necessarily, like I said, always for those summative assessment type questions. You can also assign an assessment to be practice. So under this settings mode, you can select practice instead of class assessment. And what that does, it allows students to click check answer at the top on the number of times they can check their answer, so they can't just keep doing it over and over again. And it obviously it won't work with short answer questions, but that has been really helpful too. Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable. I hope I didn't freeze there. Hopefully everything's okay.
I think you're good. Thank you.
Okay. And so anyway, so it allows them to practice, whereas it's not necessarily to get the answer right away, but to check their answer, make a second attempt if their answer isn't correct, so that they're really processing through the information as opposed to being assessed on it. And that's been a really interesting way for my students to kind of go through. And it's really funny because they thought they like caught me the first time I assigned something as a practice. They're like, you know, we can check our answers, right? And I said, yeah, that's kind of the point. I want you to check your answer and fix it if it's incorrect to figure out what the correct answer is. And then, of course, formative assessment. And the Center for Assessment says that formative assessment should have these 4 essential features: that it's inseparable from instruction, that it uses evidence of achievement to adapt what happens in classrooms to meet learner needs, and that it must gather worthwhile information for the teacher to monitor and adjust instruction, and for the student to serve as an active agent and owner of their learning, and that feedback is fundamental to formative assessment. So keeping those things in mind, I absolutely love the option to leave student feedback or leave feedback for my students to look at. And then when they go in as a student, they can click on review responses and read any of the feedback that I leave for them. And that allows me to really get into the formative assessment piece where I'm leaving feedback, they're reading the feedback, and sometimes making a second attempt, sometimes keeping that information so that they can go forward. So the quick and easy ways to add that formative assessment, that feedback to students, and the really easy way for them to see that feedback on the question that it pertains to is super helpful as well, as far as that during learning process. Okay, so that brings us to what do we do after learning? I am a big proponent of allowing redos and retakes, which Edulastic makes super easy. And I also am a huge fan of the assessment insight reports. So first of all, when I have a student that needs to retake something, I can easily click on the student, redirect the assessment, decide what they can see when they retake it, and then quickly review their improvement after they've finished that second attempt. So the possibility of redos and retakes after a summative assessment so that my students can relearn the information is super helpful. So those options just make it a game changer. My students consistently will ask me for extra credit at the beginning of a new term whenever I get new students. And by the end of the term, they realize I do not have extra credit, but they are allowed to redo and retake any of their assessments. And they really do take me up on it and ask to redo those. It's so easy to have them redo them because I can choose exactly what I want them to see and what I don't want them to see. And it's just so simple and easy. And I love it. I love the possibility for easy redos and retakes. Then there are two of the assessment insights that I really appreciate. One of them is the question frequency. And so this shows the percentage of students that answered each response to a question. And the thing I particularly love about this is notice how it highlights in yellow a question where over 20% of the students got it wrong and answered one of the other questions. So for question 8, a quarter of my students guessed B. That's a pretty big percentage to all guess the same wrong answer. So that allows me to do a lot of in-depth searching of my assessments to see if, was it a problem with the question that caused some students to get it wrong? Was there one of the distractors was not clear? It was easily confusable. So just in general of making my assessment so much stronger because I'm able to see things like a whole bunch of my students guess the same wrong answer. That might mean something. So that's huge for us. And then also the performance by the standards. I actually, for most assignments, an assignment will be entered multiple times based on the number of benchmarks that were assessed. So this quiz that students took actually was put in the grade book more than one time. And I can look at how they did on each standard and see what we're doing. We then also look at overall how we did as a class, and then we set class goals based on the benchmarks for our next assessment. We make sure that we focus on discussing that standard more when we are preparing for the next assessment. So as far as grade reporting and being able to explain to parents and students what they need to work on and setting group goals for our whole class, these standards-based reports are absolutely invaluable to us. So that is how we use Edulastic both before we start the learning process, in the middle of the learning process, and when we have given that summative assessment as well. So thank you very much for letting me speak to you all tonight.